Everyone who's part of this upcoming presentation, if you have a slideshow, we'll be putting it up, and just let us know when you want it advanced. Thank you.
So we got your. That's good. And it was kind of a state agency, PSC, I represented and really Patrick was one of his good. I thought this was Western. Questions there. Yeah. Talk a little bit about this. It's nothing. Says she's asking about my understanding. For the rest of yeah. All right. Yeah. Yeah, I'll probably listen. Spencer. Yeah, that'd be good. You know, I almost thought we had most here. Oh, yeah, well, you could. I mean, especially. You can, it's on mine. It's just, yeah. You can't hurt your. Yeah. Testing of Montana detection. There it is. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or not really, 4. No, that's 4 remote.
Hey folks, grab your seats and we'll get started with the last panel here. When I was asked a while back to sit on a panel that was talking about customer relations between regulators and utility customers, and I said there's something that you should write down, and I remember I said LTDA, put that in all caps and underline it. LTDA, lose the damn acronyms. Well, this is our acronym panel for the day. So I'm pleased to have moderator Mike Milton here. Mike not only serves on the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, Mike, longtime public servant here in Montana, and in fact, former Speaker of the Montana House of Representatives. So we're really delighted, Mike, to have you here to help us out today. And I will turn the mic over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Brad, and thanks for the Public Service Commission for putting all this important event on. I'm going to do the moderating through part of this, and then I have a governor's event in Bozeman I'm going to sneak away to. So when you see me disappear, that's what's happening, and Brad will take over from there. I want to thank everybody for participating in this throughout the day and through this event right now, and those virtual also. Appreciate you joining in. We're going to start with each of the panel members. We only have one in person. The other ones are virtual. They will be giving a presentation, about 10 minutes each. We'll go into questions and answers then after that. This is the panel on resource adequacy. And this issue has taken on some major different challenges in the last few years, especially, and due to an increased demand and a decrease in a more traditional reliable, at least a movement away from our more traditional and reliable energy sources, and increase in renewable energy. So many problems associated with all that. So here today on the panel to help us solve some of these problems, we have Christine Rapper, Vice President of External Affairs, Western Electric Coordinating Council. And then I'll be turning it over to you all here in just a minute. Sorry, Ryan Roy. I doodled all over my sheet here, so I couldn't read what it was. Director of Technology, Modeling and Analytics, Western Power Pool. Gia Anguiano, Government Relations Specialist, Resource Adequacy of Western Interstate Energy Board, and Russ Mantefel, Director of Market Initiative of Bonneville Power Administration. And then Brian is here with me. He's the Energy Analyst of Northwest Power and Conservation Council. So thank you all for joining us and taking the time to deal with this important topic. We'll start off with a presentation from Christine, please.
Well, to clarify, Chris, please. And I just want to say that two overstatements in the intro. One is that I have any amount of a presentation to give. And two is that we're going to solve the problems today on this panel. I would hope for that. I don't know if that's where we're headed in an hour and a half, but we'll see where we can get to. So
I was setting some high expectations.
Yes, you were. I want to thank Commissioner Johnston for the invite. I do wish I was there in person. I know that there's a lot of my favorite people in that room right now. So I wish I were sitting in front of you and had the opportunity to share lunch and listen to Commissioner Danley from FERC, which I missed. But with that said, I'm going to start with a statement that Chair Megan Decker from the Oregon Commission made in Hawaii this year at Western Conference. She was kind of explaining how so much is going on. And her statement was something to the effect of, now we're being asked to do everything all at once. And I totally agree with that. I know that we were invited here to discuss resource adequacy, but the entire morning has been like a sort of a buckshot of transmission and RA and organized markets and who the stakeholders are. And I think you can't separate those. I think that they're inextricably linked in some ways. And so I can appreciate how the conversation diverges on those topics. And it used to be that we had swim lanes, right? That different parts of the industry, legislators had their swim lane and commissioners had their swim lane and energy offices had their swim lane. And it's just not like that anymore. Conversations about this type of thing include everyone, which makes it really hard to get any amount of sleep. It also makes it hard to be fully present in any one conversation because we're trying to make sure that we're covering every aspect of everything that's going on. So that said, my organization, the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, is independent and resource agnostic. We are delegated from NERC to the responsibility of reliability and security of the Western Interconnection. And so I don't do slides. It's not my thing. Anyone who knows me knows that. But if you look at a map, the Western Interconnection is 14 Western states, part of Canada, and Baja, Mexico. And that's a large area. And WEC happens to be the only entity that has the view of the entire Western Interconnection. You know, I've heard a lot this morning about subregions and different entities in different areas. That's all very true. It gives us a very unique perspective at WEC of what the system looks like, what the system needs are. We also have the benefit of covering both IOUs and public power, which adds to the uniqueness of the perspective. Because I know as a former regulator, a former commissioner with the Idaho Public Utilities Commission, who I know has been well represented in these proceedings today, that when you're paying attention to what the IOUs are doing, you have no jurisdiction over public power. And public power, as it has been said today, is a major contributor to the energy situation and the energy landscape within the Western Interconnection. So I'm gonna give like a couple of high level points, and because I want to let everyone speak and then get to a discussion on matters and get questions from the audience on things. But regarding resource adequacy within the Western Interconnection, my organization just put out a Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy, and the high level of what came out from that study is that the next 1 to 4 years look okay. They look tight, but they look manageable. If you look at the 4 to 10 year time frame, we've got to do something. And so this is no longer an issue where we can just talk about it and meet and kind of wax poetic about what we think might be the best way. I appreciate Commissioner Johnson and his commission's motivation to pull something together, right? Anything together to get this ball moving, because, you know, we in the West, we are fiercely independent and we have divergent public policy. And I think that, you know, that does not help with getting all the right people in a room to have the conversation that needs to be had in order to assure resource adequacy. And they're not the only ones, you know, looking for this. It used to be that customers and businesses and stuff just wanted to make sure the lights went on and that their machinery was functioning, but they now want to know what kinds of resources are being used in order for them to get their energy. And so everyone wants to be a part of this conversation, which you've all the states, and then you have everyone within those states. So it's everyone who needs to do everything all at once. And so I'm going to leave it at that, start off at a broad, I don't know, smattering of kind of what's going on. I'm happy to answer any questions here today. I'm happy to follow up with anyone after the fact as well.
Well, thank you, Christine. Appreciate that. We'll have the questions here. We'll let everybody present or introduce themselves anyway, and we'll get back to questions then. And Ryan, go ahead.
Hopefully you can hear me.
You bet, loud and clear.
Great. I'm Ryan Roy. I'm the Director of Technology Modeling and Analytics at the Western Power Pool. For those of you that don't know, the Western Power Pool is an organization that provides member-based services generally in the reliability space. So we have a reserve sharing program, a frequency response, do some transmission planning. But I'm here today to talk about our Western Resource Adequacy Program. So very much to sort of Chris's point, we have sort of moved beyond the theoretical space, the need to sort of, you know, talk about a potential solution and, you know, in our minds, actually sort of, you know, put pen to paper where the rubber meets the road and try to get people towards a resource adequate paradigm and regime. So I'll talk a little bit about the Western Resource Adequacy Program. Talk first about the two components of it. We are currently 26 participating load responsible entities. So our participation model is an LRE, not a balancing authority or balancing authority area. Our program currently has 26 participants that spans from our friends in BC down to the desert Southwest and a few folks on the eastern side of the WEC footprint. The program has two primary components. So the first is a binding forward showing. What this binding forward showing does is it requires participants to procure enough firm capacity in the 7-month ahead time frame to meet their P50 plus planning reserve margin. So the 1 and 2 peak load plus the PRM. The binding metrics are set 2 years in advance. We have an indicative look that is 5 years in advance. I want to be very careful to say that integrated resource planning, that long-term 10, 15, 20 years, that remains the purview of the states, in no way trying to usurp that process. So there's a binding forward showing requirement, firm physical capacity for your P50 plus PRM, and a deliverability requirement of firm, conditional firm, or network service for 75% of those resources to load. Then there's a binding operational program. So if you've sort of gone through this exercise in the forward showing of sort of capturing load diversity, resource diversity, how do you share in that diversity? So we have a binding operational program. On any operating day, there's going to be some participants whose load is coming in low, whose resources are overperforming compared to what we assumed in the forward showing. They may have a capacity obligation to the program. Likewise, the flip side of that is some folks may have very high loads due to heat or cold, unit outages above what we expected in the forward showing, or VARs that are underperforming. They may have a deficit or a need. They can access that pooled capacity from the program. So it's the operations program together with modeled supply and load diversity that allows us to safely lower that planning reserve margin. So we want to benefit from the regional load and resource diversity and set a planning reserve margin that is aware of that diversity benefit while maintaining 1 in 10 loss of load. We want to help inform resource selection. Again, this remains the purview of the states. Much like Chris said, technology agnostic. We want to accredit resources in a way that reflects their contribution to the mitigation of loss of load. We do hope that this drives really those investment savings. In 2000, 2001, coming out of the energy crisis, we did see a significant amount of overbuild, so to speak. And what we're hoping for through this program is that we're informing the actual capacity need and that the need is being set appropriately, that there's installation, procurement, physical steel on the ground, in adequate supply to meet that capacity need, but not overbuilding. So really achieving that investment savings on a forward basis. So talk a little bit about the requirements in more detail here. So the RAP participants, they have to forward secure this capacity. Again, the binding, the obligation starts 7 months in advance of the binding season. That's when the showing is. 2 binding seasons, 1 in winter, 1 in summer. Those do include some of the shoulder months, traditionally where you wouldn't have seen problems. September, March, November. Recently with the heat in California, we know that those shoulder months are or can be an issue. It has to be from an identified source. And so it's very important that it's either from a unit specific or a system of resources that we can account for. I know Russ is on the FCRPS federal system, very large, but we would be tracking that system in total to ensure that it is not oversold. Holdback. And so on the operating day, these folks that may have some surplus may have a holdback obligation. And what that holdback obligation is a megawatt value for potential delivery. The folks that are deficit can raise their hand and say, oh, we're ending 14 tomorrow. It looks like I'm going to have a problem. To the extent that they wanted to access that pooled capacity, pay for it under the terms of the tariff, then it sets a binding holdback obligation for participants. They have are mandated to make capacity available on that operating hour if it's needed. If it is needed, it sets an energy delivery obligation. So on pre-schedule, on day ahead, you have a capacity, sort of the promise to make capacity available. If it's still needed in the operating hour, 120 minutes before that operating hour, it sets a binding energy delivery obligation. I'll put a note down here at the bottom. These chevrons sort of indicate the timeline. And it's important to note that there's a lot of talk in the West about market development, day-ahead markets, both on the CAISO front and SPP. And we've been thoughtful about the timelines associated with this program, particularly in the operations timeframe, to make sure that we can support those market offerings. The forward showing, we have a regional reliability metric. So this metric is set probabilistically, and it's one event day and 10 years loss of load expectation. And we're very aware of sort of the work that's going on in the broader industry, multi-metrics, looking at hours unserved, expected unserved energy, sort of some of the other components. Not all reliability events are created the same, but this is the binding metric that we've elected to utilize. We've taken a thoughtful approach to defining the hours of highest need. So we've taken a 10-year data set, we've taken that gross peak, we've netted it for VAR performance to get something that looks more like a net peak. And then we've also taken into account sort of, economic transactions. What energy and capacity would have stayed home likely, what might have been exported to, say, another reliability region like CAISO. We have a standardized way to qualify a capacity contribution, so to credit these resources. And then, of course, we set a planning reserve margin. Our planning reserve margin is a monthly reserve margin for both seasons of the year. I mentioned this earlier, there is a deliverability requirement. It is important from our perspective that you not only show the resources, but you're able to get those resources to load. In that respect, there's a deliverability requirement, 75% of your P50 plus PRM, the source to sink, firm, conditional, firm, or network transmission, with the expectation that that will be firmed up prior to the operating day. And again, this compliance 7 months in advance of the binding season. A quick overview of the operations program. We had these expectations coming out of the forward showing. In that pre-scheduled time frame, all participants are expected, having passed the forward showing, to have sufficient capacity to meet their 1 and 2 expected load. We then look at sort of the expected and anticipated conditions on the operating day. How's your load coming in? What do your outages look like? And what is your VAR performance? A positive value means you have capacity that may be obligated to the program. A negative value means that you can access pooled capacity. The energy deployment is a binding obligation. To the extent that the deficit entity has claimed the program capacity, you have a binding obligation to deliver, and that is going to be met with an energy delivery failure charge if you cannot deliver. We aren't like a market. There's no capacity procurement backstop mechanism. This is really the tool that we're using to incentivize folks to ensure that they're showing up on that operating day. Last slide here, really quick. I just want to talk about our transition to a full binding program. It's probably no surprise to you folks that some of our participants have had, for example, heavy reliance on the day-ahead bilateral market to meet much of their sort of adequacy requirements. They're also forecasting sort of, as Chris noted in this time frame, probably significant deficits on top of what they've assumed for import capability. What we didn't want to do was unnecessarily expose folks to a cost of new entry penalty. That we figured that equated to roughly a transfer of wealth. That's not what we wanted to do. So because of that, we've set up this transition to a binding program, where the expectation is the folks that sign up will all be binding by that summer 2028 timeframe, but they do have some flexibility to choose winter 24-25 all the way up until winter 26-27. So very high-level overview of the program. We are expecting folks to sign up by December 16th. We have a tariff currently filed with FERC. We did receive some comment and feedback from them on that. We're addressing that. And today we've heard from at least 11 early movers in our current group that they've elected to sign up. So we're excited about that proposition. So thank you all for the opportunity to talk about this very important topic of resource adequacy.
And thank you, Ryan. Very good. Yeah, you're next. Good.
Great, thank you. And are you all able to pull up my slides? I'm happy to do it myself as well. I know we talked about doing that.
Hold on.
Okay. Whatever is easiest, I can be flexible.
If you'd like to run your own slide deck, go for it.
Okay, great. Give me just a moment here. Okay. All right. Great. Well, thank you all so much for having me. My name is Gia Angiano, and I am with the Western Interstate Energy Board. I am the government relations specialist working on resource adequacy and wholesale electricity market development in the West. So I'm here to talk a little bit about WEEB. I know we were mentioned earlier, and I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with who we are, but still I think it's good to give a good overview, and there's a lot of acronyms. So it's really the main purpose of these slides so that we can actually know what we're talking about. So the Western Interstate Energy Board, I have a map over here on your right. And for those that aren't familiar, we're an interstate compact agency that works to promote energy policy developed through cooperative efforts through the WEEB member states and provinces and in coordination with the federal government. And right now we actually have a leadership retreat in DC. So Maury Galbraith, our executive director, as well as Laura Rennick, who is from Montana and used to be over there in the government with you all, our director of state and international federal affairs. They're all in DC with some state leaders working for commissioners and DOE representatives to talk about the things that we've been doing in the West and all that we have going on, because as Chris mentioned, it's a lot. There's a lot of lanes to swim in, and we're all kind of all over the pool. And really, we have a big goal of our main objective is to provide the tools and framework to support these cooperative efforts with the states and provinces in the West. So this framework, we have quite a few committees, and we provide staff support and technical expertise to these committees. We have the High-Level Radioactive Waste Committee, the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, or CREPC, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the Western Interconnection Regional Advisory Body, or WIRAB, and the Western EIM Body of State Regulators. And soon, once the RAP is approved and gets underway, we will also be supporting the Western Resource Adequacy Program Committee of State Representatives. So really, I want to take you to where we first got involved with this. So we have a relationship with Stanford University, and we take summer interns about every year. And in 2018, they had a project examining the current state of affairs in the West and ideas for the future around resource adequacy, trying to look at what has been done and things that could be improved and where we go forward. And really, the objective of this was to fill the need for an information collection framework that will allow regulators to easily track physical capacity and ensure that there's sufficient dispatchable built generation to meet those front office transaction obligations, especially during peak events. And it was really a way to ask ourselves, what is going on? Who's actually doing what? Is the generation actually being built? Is it being dispatched accordingly? Are these market transactions reliable or not? How do we actually account for this? There's no oversight to it. And the solution in this paper that these two interns came to was to create a central clearinghouse that actually tracks and monitors capacity. And that would be, in this case, if you were to participate in the RAP, that would be the Western Power Pool. And we continue to do this work in resource adequacy. I know that paper, Maury says it's talked about a lot, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but we also continued this work in resource adequacy in 2020 by working with experts from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the University of Texas, Austin, on the implications of a regional RA program on utility integrated resource planning. This was a way for us to really tackle what regulators and their regulated utilities would be giving up if they were to join a regional RA program. And really, the biggest things here were the ability to set the planning reserve margins and also determine capacity contribution. And so this slide, we have a little table here, and the things in red are the high-risk things that I just mentioned. Those are the things that are given up, so to say, if you join a regional RA program, but it's not really an end all be all, and it wouldn't really impact the utility IRP process too terribly. When you think about it, especially for the PRM, if you participate in the RAP with the Western Power Pool, they would just be setting the floor. You could always go higher than that if you wanted to. It's just a way to avoid penalties and ensure that we are remaining reliable. And same with the capacity contributions. Those levels are also determined by the Western Power Pool. But one of the biggest parts of the integrated resource planning is really that preferred portfolio, the utility resource mix. And that is still 100% up to the commissions and their utilities. If you join the RAP, the Western Power Pool will not be telling you what you can put in or what you have to build or anything. That still remains with the states. And that's a big thing that we really wanted to examine in this paper, is to really weigh the benefits and not risk, so to say, but if there was cons to joining the regional RA program. And it's something for the states to then decide with their utilities. And so it's papers like this and work with these regional entities that are on this panel that WEEB is really able to get into the RA space and continue this work. Obviously, once the RAP is set up, we'll be continuing that very closely by supporting the Committee of State Representatives. But there's a lot of work to do in the meantime, monitoring and trying to understand the relationship between these market developments and resource adequacy and how they all play together. And I know we were talking about that a bit earlier with CAISO and RAP. So it's an ongoing discussion, as I'm sure we all are aware of, but I'm glad I can at least be here and talk to WEEB and the things that we have done. And, those two papers that I mentioned, I think they're so prevalent today, even if they were a couple years ago, and they're found on our website, westernenergyboard.org. And I also have my contact information. I am working on this along with my team. We are small but mighty, and I'm happy to continue the discussion in any way that we can. So thank you.
Gia, thank you. That's very appreciate it. Russ, you're up.
Hi, folks. I think I'm gonna focus on BPA's approach to participation in RAP. We've been part of the process since the program's inception. So the BPA is currently evaluating whether to join RAP. We think that it has potential to provide significant benefits, a lot of which were discussed by the Gia, Ryan, and Chris before. BPA, we are working on the program from a multitude of perspectives as a public power entity. So we have our own preference customers that we are what we call loads. We're the load serving entity for our load following customers. And in that respect, Bonneville acts as a traditional utility in terms of having to show qualifying carrying capacity to meet our obligations. In addition, several of our customers are slice customers, which take a flexible product and they serve as their own LSEs or load responsible entities under the program, LREs, where we supply power to them. So we've worked on the program from several different perspectives, and I think I have a lot of stakeholders that are looking to what we're going to do in regards to the program. In general, Bonneville feels very positive about the program, thinks that the issues that are trying to be addressed by the program are critical for the West, and glad that the program itself has continued to be viable and really expanded over the course of its development from being just focused on the Pacific Northwest and the power pool itself changing the name it does business under from the Northwest Power Pool to the Western Power Pool, reflecting that there's common agreement that this is a significant issue that needs a regional solution. Bonneville proposed that we would join the program. So we are going through a formal decision process that we're hoping wraps up next week in time for the December 16th deadline. And we did propose that we would join the program. We had a draft letter to the region that discussed that. And we went into great detail in terms of the benefits that are involved in the program, both for Bonneville and for the region, as well as some of the risks involved that I think are common risks that most utilities are trying to evaluate as part of their own participation. So I think, I'd encourage folks, if you have the time to read, I think our 90-page letter that evaluates that, or if you just need to fall asleep, that is a good tool as well. But I think it does provide insight into how I think all utilities really are looking at it. We have our own specific statutes. We exist in sort of a unique context, but at our heart, we're still a utility. And I think that it was helpful for us to be able to articulate how a utility evaluates whether to participate in the program. And so we did propose that we would join, and we'll do a final letter next week that will determine whether we ratify that as part of a final decision. And the program itself has a transition period where the entities can elect the season in which they go binding, and during that period where they are fully subject to all of the components of the tariff, including the financial consequences of performance or non-performance. And we're proposing to go live or to go binding in the last one of the last seasons in either 2027 or 2028. Our hope would be that we're able to move that forward, but the program did, I think, shine a light on some of the things that we knew were areas that we needed to focus on in terms of ensuring that we're able to demonstrate on a long-term basis exactly how we're going to serve load. And so we will use the intervening period to try to resolve those things as well. And hopefully we'll be able to find a solution that works well, and maybe try to move that up. And go binding a bit earlier. So next week, it's our target to put out a final decision. We took public comment and had public meetings to evaluate our proposal to join. We're reviewing all of those right now, and then drafting our final letter as we speak. And that's kind of where we are, and look forward to the discussion today.
You bet, Russ, and thank you. Ryan from
Okay.
Northwest Power Conservation Council.
Thank you, Councilmember Ward. This is almost like a job interview for me. I've got two of my council members in the room, Councilmember Doug Robb and Mike here. A couple of years ago, I did a resource adequacy presentation at ETIC. I can't remember if it was this summer or last summer, but it doesn't seem like much has changed since then. So anyways, that was kind of an overview of the 7th Power Plan. But now I would like to give you guys a kind of an overview of who the Northwest Power Conservation Council, and a little bit of stuff that we're seeing going forward. We're in the process of doing a resource adequacy assessment right now. So I'll get into that in a few minutes. But the Northwest Power Planning Council was formed in 1980 under the Northwest Power Act. It was kind of formed, there was some issues in public power in the Pacific Northwest in the late 70s. If everybody heard of the acronym called OOPS, they tried to build a bunch of nuclear power plants, and only one is still operating out of, I believe, 5. So Congress came together, the delegation of the Pacific Northwest, and created the Northwest Power Act. First power plan was early 80s. We've had 8 power plans since then. The goal of the Power Planning Council is we do a fish and wildlife plan and a power plan every 5 years. The power plan comes after the fish and wildlife plan. It's to basically mitigate and enhance fish and wildlife recovery in the Pacific Northwest that are impacted by the federal hydro system. The power plan itself, the objective of the power plan is to provide an adequate, efficient, economical, reliable power system. So that's the goal of the power plan when we put it together. And I already talked about the fish and wildlife is to protect and mitigate and enhance fish. The power plan, we do basically we focus every 5 years on the power plan. We do a 5-year plan, and we look also at a 20-year plan within that, a 5-year planning horizon, the 20-year lookout. People who use our power plan, obviously BPA uses it. The local utilities in the Pacific Northwest, the PSCs, many policymakers and others in the region have use in our plan. We're very open group. We have numerous advisory committees. We have a resource adequacy advisory committee, system analysis advisory committee. We have energy efficiency advisory committees. One of the things that the council has done is since the creation of the Northwest Power Act, we don't necessarily do energy efficiency, but within the power plan, there is energy efficiency
forecast and energy efficiency goals. And over the time of the council, the region has done almost 700 or 7,000 megawatts of energy efficiency. That's average megawatts of energy efficiency. That's a lot of coal strips. So that's a lot of energy efficiency, and that's power that someone didn't need to buy, or a plant didn't need to be built. It is slowing down. Energy efficiency is slowing down. In the seventh power plan, we forecasted approximately 1,400 average megawatts of energy efficiency. In this last power plan, we are forecasting 750 average megawatts, with a range up to 1,000. The reason that has happened is because the price of renewables has fallen so much. And if you look at the market prices, there's not as much energy efficiency that is cost effective. So in the seventh power plan, it was a lot of energy efficiency, demand response, and basically maintain the status quo. Now going into the eighth power plan, we've seen a lot change. You've seen the price of renewables falling. We're seeing retirements. So the issues we're seeing there coming out of that, we're looking forward for the Pacific Northwest, around 3,500 megawatts of renewables. That's wind and solar, battery. Then we're also seeing demand response, and we're seeing some gas. The issue that I would like to stress is there is retirement within this, but we are forecasting a significant need for reserves. The need for reserves is not going away. In fact, it keeps getting higher and higher. So it's what the models are seeing is the resources are there. They just need to be dispatched when we need them. And sometimes you just can't get them dispatched fast enough. So that's what a lot of the accuracy problems that we're seeing within the model is. The plants are not dispatching when we need them, or they can't get them up fast enough. So it's another thing that we're also seeing is looking at the hydro system, and what we're calling banking hydro, where during the middle of the day, you can move solar north and you can store water. Basically, you're not generating, you're using that to supply energy to Pacific Northwest, where then in the ramping hours of the evening or morning, you can actually use that water to produce electricity, or you could sell it when it's needed. BPA has done very well recently doing that, and they've had excellent revenue because of that. So that's to talk about that and the resource adequacy assessment that we're working on right now, we can't. The model and resorts, when we look at a loss of load probability, is our current metric that we use, and we're looking at using 3 or 4 different metrics. We're in the process right now of looking at different metrics, but we see that we're fairly adequate when we look at kind of the baseline forecast, and if we rely on markets a little bit. But if we start to move away from a little bit of market reliance, we start to have more problems. If we start to see whack high load growth, electrification issues, we see retirement of large, to name a plant, either the Lower Snake River dams or Colstrip, we start seeing issues when those plants start going away. So obviously this stuff in the modeling is just starting to happen. We had a big resource adequacy call on Monday, and some of the results are coming out. We've got some results that we're going to release next week again, and then a final probably in February. And there's a few people in this room who are on that call on Monday, I see. So, but yeah, that's kind of how we're looking. It's, it doesn't look great for the regional resource adequacy if we start losing a lot of reserves, and they're needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Time for questions. Any here in the room? Any questions? Doug.
What makes resources conservation doable and not doable? And also, how large is the region in which this is being looked at? Describe that to the audience of this, please. Thank you.
This is my boss who wants me to explain that to him, so I better do a good job. We have staff in Portland who are energy efficiency experts. And what they do is they create a bottom-up, top-down energy efficiency supply curve, looking at all different efficiencies. And then we put that supply curve in a model we have called the regional portfolio model. And it's a Monte Carlo simulation that looks at all kinds of different resources. And as it runs through, it picks different resources and energy efficiency. If it's in the money, it picks it, or it picks renewables, or it picks gas, or it picks, doesn't really necessarily pick demand response, but it looks at demand response and batteries and other, and so what we saw in this last power plan, that it picked renewables rather than picking conservation to extreme degree. The energy efficiency does provide a capacity value, and we try to account for that as well. But it still picked more renewables than it did picking energy efficiency. And the other question was, what's our footprint? Basically, the footprint that we look at is the Continental Divide, about 80 miles east of the Continental Divide, the 4 states of Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho. There is a little bit of BPA load at Roller Valley, south of Jackson Hole in Wyoming, but they do not have representatives on the council.
Thanks, Brian. Anyone else on the panel want to chime in? Nope. All right. Thank you. Any other questions here in the audience or out there in virtual land?
Mike Cashel, Northwestern Energy. Brian, you mentioned solar moving north during renewables moving north, I guess. So my understanding there was that at certain times you can move renewables during the peak of the day in the southwest to the northwest, save water. So when you looked at that, how did that wrap up? Was that, I guess the way to put it, was that considered kind of an opportunity resource that is there some of the time? Was it modeled as a firm resource? Just how did that contribute to capacity?
I'll try to answer that without being the model, but it did look like an opportunity resource where it's coming in the middle of the day and then it's disappearing in the evening ramp. So you can arbitrage that. I mean, you've got negative prices during some parts of the day. But the thing that I did see that concerns me is, especially relying on market transactions like that, the model results we're still seeing morning ramp issues and afternoon ramp issues. That solar is just not showing up in that situation, especially if there's low water years and you just don't have the hydro capacity to save water. So those are the situations that there are issues.
Okay.
Does that clarify things a bit?
Yes, that helps a lot. And follow-up question. You mentioned you're seeing a lot more need for reserves. Can you quantify that a little bit in the different scenarios for us?
I'm going to have to get back to you on that one.
Okay. I'm just wondering if we're, 10%, 20%, how that might ramp up over the power plan planning.
Yeah, I'm going to have to reach out to our modeler who's doing that. But as you increase electrification and you retire resources, we are seeing more need for the reserves. And it a lot had to do with the forecasting error, wind and solar as well. And then it had to do with the demand forecasting errors. The more error you had, the more reserves you needed. And that's not going away there's less need for reserves with solar because you can see it, but when there's more need for reserves because it's hard to forecast.
And last question, how does that reserve need tie back into the reserve planning margin RAP, for instance? Have your studies been used to inform the RAP folks?
Yeah, I know one of our modelers, Jean Fazio, has been very active in the RAP, and we use a associated system carrying capacity that we look at how we model our resources. For instance, a combination of wind and solar up to 500 or 5,000 megawatts, the way we do the stochastic analysis of looking at different combinations of resource only had a 14% capacity factor. So
Thank you.
So to elaborate a little bit too on the planning reserve margin conversation, part of what WEC has found has occurred is there used to be peaks, right? There was the hottest part of summer, the coldest part of winter, but because of variable resources being added to the system is not reacting the same way that it used to. So there's no longer a peak in the summer and a peak in the winter. You can't rely on that anymore. It's throughout the year. And so the studies come out looking different, which increases the planning reserve margin because you've got to pay attention to more than just 1 or 2 days out of the year in order to make sure that you're resource sufficient.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel like to comment? You all on the panel chime in anytime you want on any of these questions. So
I was
this
just going
is-
to add from.
go ahead.
Oh, so I was going to add really quickly the notion of the solar being an opportunity resource. Anecdotally, that makes sense. It's really variable the extent to which that actually manifests. So planning from a reliability perspective, it's tough to consider that super firm. So I think intuitively that makes sense to me based on what we've seen.
And I was just to sort of echo what Russ said there. When we did our reliability modeling for the resource adequacy program, we separated the footprint into 2 regions, sort of the Pacific Northwest, the Desert Southwest, and Eastern footprint. And for us, because of this deliverability requirement, we didn't assume any transfer capability between those zones. We have in our tariff the ability to utilize it should it be put into the program. We understand what impact that region to region or sub-region to sub-region transmission connectivity would have on the planning reserve margins. But from a reliability perspective, this is one of the things that has caused sort of our participants a little bit of heartburn is making any assumption about import capability. We really have a forward procurement requirement in the program, and the planning reserve margins in those regions currently don't reflect sub-region to sub-region transfer capability because we don't have sort of firm transmission that we can dedicate to the program to bring those planning reserve margins down. We know what that would look like. Maybe that informs over the long term, a transmission build or something like that. But because this is a reliability program with the forward procurement and deliverability requirement, we didn't assume in our studies sort of any import capability. The resources in that subregion are utilized to meet the load or mitigate loss of load in those subregions.
One thing I'd note in the power planning process, we do limit import capability on the system. In the winter, I believe it's 2,500 and it's about 1,250 in the summer for the import capabilities of that. I guess it'd be non-firm resources. There's already firm resources coming in, but that's what we limit it to on the transfer for the modeling purposes.
Thank you. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Hi, Jamie Stamets with the Montana Consumer Council. I heard you talking earlier that the model is having issues with resources ramping fast enough. If the resources were there, they weren't ramping. Is that just due to the amount of ramp or is it due to the technology type?
Jamie, I think a lot has to do with just the gas nominations and not having the gas available in time and not having, if the plant's completely off, you're not at a minimum. If the plant's completely off, it takes time to ramp up. If you're at a minimum, you have some time to ramp up the plant. So that's kind of what the issue, from what I understand, is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Doug, did you have some? You're good. All right. Anyone else out there on this topic?
Yeah, I'll add, and I think this is for both the last discussion and this discussion. I think that's also where market design and the resource adequacy program have room to grow and develop in the West. I think that the notion of like a plant not being able to ramp when needed because for example, if they weren't committed and they didn't have gas nominated or they don't have time to get to their like PMIN so that they can ramp up, hopefully with the expansion of like day ahead markets, and if you're effectively pricing, that flexibility in the market, that hopefully those units, I think that there's room with regionalization, hopefully, to create a system where those units are committed, when you're looking at the broad demands of the region. And so I think that market development probably also goes away in terms of more efficiently utilizing existing resources as well.
Thank you. Any other questions out there? Any more? I'll just throw one out there. What we've all talked about resource adequacy. You have each of you on the panel of what you have done in your own organization. How are you working together, or do you work together? Do you want to anyone to grab onto that one? Tell us how you're coordinating with the other organizations here that have been on the panel, or anyone else.
I'll tackle that one because that's sort of my primary role in my job. There are a lot of seams. Everyone lovingly refers to them as seams in the West, and whether it's between different markets or different states or different programs, somebody has to talk across the seams to one another to make sure that there is a dialogue going on. And so WEC is working on those relationships with those stakeholders in order to make sure they are talking to one another, and that there's a view of what that conversation is, right? And when it comes to reliability within the Western Interconnection, then we're very interested to make sure that those conversations are occurring, because the same thing that happened with front office transactions, as Gia had in her slides, right? The whole issue was that everybody thought that they were relying on their neighbor for the last portion of the energy that they were going to utilize to serve their customers, only nobody was paying attention to whether those contracts overlapped one another or complemented one another. And as it turned out, they were overlapping. And so that was part of the oh my God moment in the Western Interconnection, I think just several years ago, of we are not resource adequate here. We've really got to pay attention to this, because nobody was paying attention to what their neighbors were doing or where that resource was coming from. So I think the dialogue is the most important part of it. And I would add, there was talk about legislatures and stuff earlier. Legislatures didn't used to concern themselves about these things, but they are now. And so to ignore them would be at our peril, right? We need to educate the legislators on the types of things that they're talking about and the type of legislation that they're looking at, in order to make sure that there are not unintended consequences, or at least that we can minimize the unintended consequences that come from that action, because it takes years to become familiar. I mean, the acronyms alone in this panel this afternoon, right? I'm sure that the majority of people in the room probably couldn't figure out every acronym that was utilized. So legislators are not in the best position to have a deep working knowledge of what's going on, but they are getting involved because their constituents are demanding that they get involved. And so conversations and talking to those people to educate them on what's going on, and talking across borders and across the seams, I think is one of the most important parts of what we need to do in order to successfully meet resource adequacy needs.
And I can jump in here too, because, going across those themes, I feel like that's a big part of what Weeb does. It's why we exist. We have had a brief slide mentioning some of this, but we have WIRA, another acronym, but the Western Interconnection Regional Advisory Body. They have the authority to advise FERC, NERC, and WEC on a variety of issues, anything that the body chooses to reflect upon. And we also have CREPC, Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation. We have those joint CREPC WIRA events biannually, and that's a great place to get the utilities, the commissioners, FERC commissioners, when there's the opportunity for legislators to come in to have these discussions, because this resource adequacy discussion is not disappearing anytime soon. It's more and more prevalent every single day, especially as regional RA programs like the RAP are being stood up. And we will continue to interact with entities on this panel like Western Power Pool through our engagement with the Committee of State Representatives, and just try to foster a space to keep the utility commissions and energy offices really engaged on these issues, and make sure that we are trying to talk across the lines and make sure we're all on the same page. It's an uphill battle, that's for sure, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon.
I feel like there was I feel like the hopeful response was a single forum whereby all of the interested folks are, engaging on what is, everybody considers to be a very important issue. I think I have the same perspective. I think that Chris and Gia have. We have now, this issue is at the forefront of a lot of folks' minds, both from a reliability perspective, achieving the efficiencies through market development that Russ talked about. We are having these conversations. Unfortunately, there is not probably currently a single unified space to do that. But I think that the movement has been towards more communication as opposed to less. This is an issue that is front and center for a lot of folks, and I think I feel like is sort of garnering now maybe the appropriate attention it should have gotten sooner.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of improvement, but a lot of work needs to be done. It's just still in terms of that coordination. I mean, 10, 15, 20 years ago, I think if up until now, if you just informally looked at integrated resource planning proposals, whether it's from IOUs or publics and RFOs, sort of a lot of people were making assumptions about the same resources. I think Gia and Chris have talked about that. It's like everybody was kind of going to the market and it was working out for a while and it was economic and that made sense, but it didn't all add up. And I think there's a realization of that moving forward. And I think that what the Power Pool is putting together is a really big step forward for everybody to be talking about that. And I think building on that is really important because I think because of the changing nature of the bulk electric system these days, it's important that everybody coordinate. And historically, being able to optimize on your own, I think worked well, right? But nowadays, if everybody's optimizing, nobody's optimized. And I think everybody's got to sort of do it together and sort of recognize the interconnected reliance that ennitities have. And so I think there's been a lot of progress made, but I think a lot of progress still needs to be made. And there's these sort of like mega or like meta seams as well between different like areas of the industry in terms of like investor-owned utilities, public utilities, IPPs, et cetera. And I think that's an area where we need to especially focus on having everybody, irrespective of the nature of their organization, we're all part of the bulk electric system, and we need to make it work well and really focus on making sure that everybody's transparent about that so everybody can deliver the value and reliability to their own customers.
Yeah, and I would say that I would add to that, Russ, the urgency is real and the entities know it, right? And so it's not just us, it's not just regulators, it's not just energy offices. When we have conversations, when we have conversations with people in the region, the urgency from them is real. They know that these conversations need to occur. Their biggest priority is to be able to provide energy to their customers when their customers need energy. Otherwise, they're not making money, right? An investor-owned utility, no matter how you look at it, even if their ultimate benefit is to us, stock, for shareholders, it doesn't matter. They're not going to be able to do that if they're not reliably providing service to their customers. And so the urgency is real and felt. And I think that everyone is trying to push in the same direction. But to the point of Commissioner Johnson, and the reason I think that this docket was undertaken in Montana, not everyone has the same motivations for getting where they think that we need or want to be, and trying to do something across the entire footprint would be that much more difficult because of the differences between the states. So, something on a smaller scale, if it moves the ball forward, at least we're making forward movement.
And I was honestly pretty, I might be kind of jaundiced at this point in my life, but I was not super positive at the very beginning of the Power Pool process that it was going to work out. I think it takes so many entities, including like the regulatory commissions and different planning authorities, to buy in to a common standard that I wasn't betting on it working, frankly. but instead of just working, it expanded drastically, right? And it really took off. And the fact that you had entities in the desert Southwest and outside of the Pacific Northwest that are trying to get in and involved in the program, I think represents a really positive development in terms of the region working together.
You know, a lot of those things that you all have talked about, sort of how do you ensure that you're not double counting capacity, that there's a common planning standard. You know, our program is working to address those things. When you come to the program, you bring your entire portfolio such that we have visibility into, you know, sort of what those contracts are, where they're going, what load they're being utilized to serve. You know, the common planning standards set probabilistically using best practices methodologies. There is this idea of kind of the rubber meeting the road. We know we have work to do. Some of the capacity accreditation, how do you treat things like, you know, energy storage? What does it look like when you have the baseload and peaking resources being retired? We've got, you know, what do you do with, you know, how do you appropriately accredit, you know, wind and solar in certain zones? What do we do about these transmission limitations? But it is now a platform whereby a broad swath of the West has come together, you know, by and large, agreed to do the right thing, despite the fact that some of our participants do have a long road to hoe, so to speak. You know, they've got some work to do to transition away from that reliance on the day-ahead market, ensuring they're having that capacity procured on a forward basis, working with their counterparties to ensure they've got firm physical supply. But, you know, they've been working in the tent for 3 years to arrive at a spot where they can stand up and say, yes, this is important. This is important. We've heard, as Chris mentioned, you know, folks have an expectation that when they turn the light switch on, the lights come on. That's you know, basically a fundamental human right now. And we want to ensure and help folks across the West make sure to you know, be able to deliver that service in a reliable way and achieve some sort of economic benefits, particularly in that forward time horizon. Start to layer on things like a market, then you're achieving some of the efficiencies that Russ talked about. But, you know, we think having a footprint that is 26 folks in the West currently, hoping that expands, broad geographic. Of course, we have the issues with what you do with a large entity like CAISO. That gets into the SEAMS issues where somebody like WEC can be tremendously helpful. But we do think in terms of kind of practical implementation of the things that folks have been worried about, we have really been trying hard with, you know, really the help and strong support of our members to get a regional program to a point where you can start to address this on a broader scale. We got things like IRP planning, what has this fit into the long-term horizon, you know, some of those issues to work through, but really, and by and large, to get to a common planning standard, a broad regional footprint to benefit from diversity, and a, you know, program and a platform whereby you can address these things on a continuous and ongoing basis.
So I would add also, Ryan, the additional hurdle that I think that the participants in that program have is the commissions, right? For all of this, for resource adequacy in general, whether it is within the RAP program or just to meet resource adequacy needs of their own customers, you know, a lot of commissioners, the commissioner panel earlier today, and there's been a lot of participation by state commissioners in this conference, and you know, that's real for them, and the cost to customers and what is necessary versus what is gold plating. And these are all things that commissioners have wrestled with for years. But I do think that the used and useful standard that a lot of commissions have utilized for a while to determine recovery of those costs, that maybe, you know, that needs to, a second look needs to be taken at that, because we're clearly in a tight situation, and commissioners don't want the lights to go out any more than the utilities do, you know, but in entering any of these programs or adding resources or anything that those investor-owned utilities are going to do in furtherance of ensuring resource adequacy, those things have costs. And, you know, the commissioner panel earlier today, I think, did a really good job of kind of highlighting that they're looking at customers that may or may not be able to absorb these things, and how exactly does that look and work. And that's real. I have the luxury at WEC to be able to deem what is necessary for the system to run without regard, right? I don't want a gold-plated system either, but it's not our job to call the winners and losers on costs. And I'm grateful for that, not being in that role anymore, because I think that's a really hard balance that the commissioners are going to have to make.
I know John Fazio at the Power and Conservation Council, who I'm sure Ryan works with a fair amount. He is, all the time on record saying this is kind of a cost and risk trade-off. It's an uncomfortable conversation, as Chris has noted, but that's sort of what this is. Would somebody pay for, sort of the theoretical 100% reliability? Probably not if you had a risk-based conversation around that. But you're right, this has real costs for our participants and their ratepayers. I don't want to undersell the importance of, WEEB in this sort of process. They have helped us get the states engaged, sort of help us build, general support for this program. We were very thankful to see their comments on the tariff, showing strong support from broad states across the West. So it's a non-trivial exercise, you're right, Chris, to get all of these folks with varying policy goals, different opinions on resource stacks and mixes, cost allocation and these types of things on board. WEEB has been very helpful in doing that, or helping us with that. But it is, by way of this committee of state representatives, an important and ongoing consideration. How are we making sure that the states are continuing to be involved in this process? And we've, building on sort of the success of the BOSS are hoping we are going to achieve that.
Okay, thank you all for that. Looking into the future, and we've hit on this, I know a little bit, but looking into the future with the electrification of cars, heat, a little bit of everything. What kind of challenges do you see? Not today, tomorrow, a year or so from now, but looking a few years from now. What kind of challenges do you see to ensure that we have resource adequacy in the Western interconnection? Ryan?
Well, I'll start here. So there's a couple things. The first thing is, how do we deal with climate change? I participated in a conversation earlier today where in the Pacific Northwest, we've seen real fundamental changes in load. It gets hot, and folks in the Pacific Northwest, the Seattle area, who traditionally haven't had air conditioning, now they're going to buy, sort of ductless air conditioning units. And one was great, so they're putting 2 and 3 in their house. So we have that. We have sort of electrification of the vehicle and transportation, sector. That's going to be something to deal with. Our traditional definition of a 1 in 2 or 1 in 10 day event, that probably looks different under climate change. Clearly, sort of the retirement of the thermal, the peaking and baseload resources, that's going to be an issue. At 100% renewables, you have sort of a not yet developed perfect resource. So somehow we have to get there to meet these aggressive renewable goals, which I think our organization is supportive of. So I think the benefit we have is, I feel very similarly to Chris, that when we look at what our modeling results are showing, at least in the very near term, there is capacity, out there. It has to get in the right folks' hands, but that's a situation that degrades over time. In the desert Southwest, probably less excess capability and capacity there. And in order to meet their sort of low growth goals, they have to sort of build over 5 to 7 years. That's with supply chain issues, COVID issues. So I'm thankful we're not at a point now where we have, less capacity than is necessary to meet our reliability metric, but we're quickly getting to the point where, we have to deal with the requirements, deal with integration, renewable integration, and deal with all the changes in load related to, population growth, climate change, et cetera. So broad kind of brushstrokes, that's where I see the primary issues. And then, of course, the problem that we have in the West, which Chris has highlighted, is, a lot of strong independent bodies. We have to find a way to do this together in a way that keeps folks under some tent. So. my opinion.
So I feel like I pour cold water on everything today, but I'm a realist above all else, right? It's who I am, it's how I present, it's how I think. And the reality is that we don't have the ability to foresee and plan the system the way that we used to because of extreme weather conditions, because of adding electrification of vehicles and just overall electrification to the system. And so it has become, even outside of electrification, the addition of variable resources, which we're not entirely familiar with yet, right? And the impact that they have on the system, and severe weather, which is no longer a one-off, right? We're not looking at 1 in 10 years for these storms. These things are happening every year. We've got these heat domes and heat waves going on that we are not used to planning for. The system was not built to be able to sustain this kind of environment, which we are now seeing. And so a regime of planning based on historical data is no longer reliable to the extent that it used to be in order to be able to plan the future system. And so I guess that's my additional pitch for why I think the commissioners have to start looking uniquely at how these things are impacting the systems and the customers in their states. I understand where they're coming from, wanting to make sure that customers are not paying more than they have to. But again, Ryan's point of, I think Ryan or Russ said risk and security, right? Of having that energy. The system is not what it used to be, even for planning purposes, not even to consider electrification of vehicles. There are studies underway now. There's a California mobility study that one of our vice presidents, Brandon Suddeth, is involved in, and they are attempting, I think it's California, WEC, NERC, and maybe somebody from the DOE and maybe some of the labs, don't quote me on that, but they are doing a study right now to try and determine the impact of adding electric vehicles to the system and what that does and how that might be managed in the long term. But I don't know if they're putting the cart before the horse or not, when California already has requirements in place for when it's going to be entirely electrified. So there's a lot to consider, and I think reliability has to be first above all else.
This is Brian. A couple of things that we've recently done at the council is this is the first power plan we actually looked at future climate data. In the past, we've always used historical data, and this is that we used University of Washington and some other under the government climate agency. We use forward-looking climate data, and what that did is it kind of shifts water a little bit, and it shifts precipitation levels. But you also see within that, you see the extreme events. It might be a little bit warmer in the winter, but you still have extreme polar vortexes. You have other events that still happen. So yeah, you're using the new forecast for climate change. There are significant issues looking forward, rather than, historical. You saw that as well, but we're trying to look forward. And for the decarbonization side of things and electrification, we have been looking at that. We've ran scenarios, and the highway case was one of our problem cases where you see high electrification in the WEC. And regarding electric vehicles, the road is not there yet, but it looks like it's coming. I had to do a presentation to the council last month on EVs, and the trajectory is very high considering what came out of the Inflation Reduction Act and what's happening with charging infrastructure going forward.
I'm going to jump in real quick and just add, there's clearly a lot of research and studies going on, and this question is pretty apt. We've even recently received a state proposal to examine electrification trends in the West, the implications for electricity demand and forecasting and resource adequacy. And it's something that we're all going to have to wrestle with. And thinking of things that Chris and Ryan and others have said today, it's very clear the demand is increasing greatly. And Ryan, I think, had mentioned the supply chain issues. We just have an obscene amount of generation to build, and it's very difficult to catch up. And I think those are the biggest issues that are going to be posing problems for us down the road and making sure and prioritizing resource adequacy. And I think that points towards participating in some regional RA program where you can lean on utilities and try to harness that generation some other way when you are not able to build the generation yourself. And just try to address it. It's a good foundation to at least making sure that we can keep the lights on in the future.
I don't have much to add. I'll just echo this. And, we're a little different in that our customers are other utilities that elect to take service from us, but we hear it consistently, right? That electrification is going to pick up speed, that load is going to be changing over time. And that's it's a major thing for us to focus on. And I think the rest of the panel addressed the question really well.
Other panelists' comments? Wonderful. I apologize that Speaker Milburn had another commitment, had to leave. You're stuck with me, but you've only got 13 minutes left, so we'll muddle through. I want to pose, first, let me make an observation. I don't believe I know of anyone who's suggesting that demand isn't going to do anything other than increase dramatically as we go forward. I don't know of anyone that suggests that we're not going to continue to see a significant decrease in the amount of traditional baseload generation that's available to meet that load. I don't know of anyone who suggests that we're not going to see increased dependence on intermittent sources of generation. Those, I think, are pretty much matters of fact. When I look at something like the discussion that I've been listening to with regard to RAP, and don't misunderstand, I think it's a tremendous initiative, and I salute the parties that have put in really hard and I think effective efforts to bring that proposed program to this point. But my question is to anyone who wish to respond, if in fact we see increasing demand, we see more and more indication that we're going to see more dual peaking states, both winter and summer. So we're going to have some more critical peak periods that we have to deal with. So we look at this idea that says we're going to have these participants essentially set aside in their reserve excess capacity, if you will, so that we can help smooth all of that out for different participants in the program when the time comes. My question is, in the near term, at least, where are we going to see the development of that new excess capacity that's going to be moved around to meet demand in those areas? When everything that I see out there in the near term works against that. So any of you that want to jump in on that, feel free.
That's a
Well,
great
so I guess
question, Commissioner Johnson. I'll leave it to somebody else to answer.
So a couple things. So, when we did our studies, there's a couple different outcomes that you could have when we look at these reliability studies. You could have an amount of capacity that is far below what is necessary to maintain on a regional or sub-regional basis, in this case, a one event day in 10 loss of load. So that would be a really, really bad kind of outcome. Our studies didn't show us, there yet. And then the opposite end of the spectrum is having so much surplus capacity that you have to sort of start taking a bunch of it out of the model, and you, from a reliability perspective, say, okay, well, it's just a matter of establishing a metric on a forward basis, getting folks to procure that such that the capacity is in the right places. We also weren't there. There was, some amount of surplus, probably short of that gives you confidence that in the short term, and that's maybe the 2 to 5 year time frame, that if you establish a forward metric in our program and sent folks to, procure that on a forward basis, right? That's ensuring that we're getting it in the right spots where it's necessary. then you have that sort of excess on the operating day. You're absolutely right. So we do indicative modeling, and this is sort of just before the IRP planning process. If you're showing a significant need, 5, 7, 8 years down the road, you have to start putting that steel in the ground, and that's a real problem. There's not an easy answer to that. I think we believe that if you establish a forward planning metric, establish a framework under which folks are incentivized to do this on a forward basis, help them understand sort of what the sort of cost of that capacity is, that folks will try to do the right thing, and that's maybe working with their commissions, it's contracting with folks. Sure, there's GI interconnect. What do you do about transmission? Those problems aren't going to get better by themselves. What we do believe that by establishing a forward planning metric, incentivizing folks to be doing that forward procurement, getting the capacity in the right spots, that's a step in the right direction. It's not going to solve what do you do about transmission build, how do you get projects sited, how can you put resources in the ground that are reliable but sort of maybe counter to what a state long-term goals are. Probably doesn't fix those in the short term, but it does set a metric. It does incentivize folks through the cost of new entry penalty to meet that metric, utilize as efficiently as possible the capacity that is there currently on a forward basis, and send the right signals to be, looking at that build on the longer term kind of forward horizon.
I would also add, I think Commissioner Johnson, we have some recent examples of what can be done to meet those resource adequacy needs, like Diablo, and reopening or keeping Diablo open. However, you want to reference that. I think that when the larger public, when the legislators, when the government, I don't know who has to be made aware and have their hair on fire first, but clearly there are adjustments that can be made with resources that are being retired early if supply chain and other impediments are getting in the way of building the new resources within the timeframes that we need them in order to have a reliable system. So I think the resources exist, and maybe it just means moving some of those retirement dates and adjusting those in order to make sure that there's enough energy and capacity to feed all the customers.
Other panelists want to weigh in on that. I'll take that as a no. Well, I would say, A, I appreciate the responses. B, there's not a question in my mind, but what we have the ability in aggregate to generate enough energy to meet demand. I remain concerned that we have today with the decreasing level of base load that's available and the increasing independence on intermittent. I am not convinced that we have a very strong guarantee that we can move that energy to the place it needs to be when it needs to be there on an absolutely consistent basis. And the fact that we're doing okay on average is all well and good, but it doesn't solve the problem for the folks that are looking at that rolling brownout at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night in February, because in fact that excess capacity wasn't there to move around. And I hope that Commissioner Raper's assessment is right, that there is a real potential out there to take a step back, take a deep breath, and slow some of this, what I frankly consider to be premature closure of some of this base load, so that we can help avoid those situations. And I didn't mean to get on a soapbox here, but there's that thought. I'm going to throw one more question out to the group, and then we'll call it a day. And that is, having talked about all of these scenarios and the potential risks and upsides and all of that, who ultimately should we look to in terms of being responsible to make sure that we achieve resource adequacy in the region? where does that responsibility ultimately fall?
I can go ahead. Oh, sorry, Chris. I can go ahead and jump in here. Gia with Weave. And really, ultimately, I think this is something that falls under state jurisdiction and it's not a federal issue. You know, in the West, most electric utilities submit their IRPs to the Regulatory Commission or their governing body. And it's that body and their utilities that are responsible for this. WEC, NERC, FERC, they're absolutely held. They have so much expertise, and WEC does have the benefit of having that interconnection-wide overview. But at the end of the day, I think it falls on the states. It's within their jurisdiction.
So mine's going to sound like a cop out, but I don't dodge. You know that, Commissioner Johnson, and so it really is my honest answer. I think it's shared. I think that commissions are responsible for allowing cost recovery for the utilities to do what they need to do to meet those demands. But I do feel like WEC has a responsibility to make sure that those state commissioners and energy offices, governor's offices, and legislatures understand what it is that is needed in order for the utilities to be able to continue to provide the reliable service. And so I'm not the appropriate audience for this quote, but because it's Hillary Clinton, but it is going to take a village. I think that partnership that was talked about on the earlier panel, it's just so important that we're talking to one another and making sure. I really do feel like my role, my own role at WEC in talking with the commissions and energy offices and educating them on what they ought to be looking for and at, because it's not traditional. It's not the traditional approach. And so even if you've been a commissioner for 20 years, it doesn't look the same as it looked like before. They've got to start looking at things differently. No different than, we've been trying to change rate design for how many years, for at least a couple of decades, but this has got to happen sooner, and people have to pivot and understand that they need to be working with one another. No single entity can make it occur on their own.
I think so coming from public power, I think it's broad. I think the responsibility is broad. I think the commissions don't have jurisdiction over all of the load and resources in the West. And so I think what you need are organizations that are able to reach across the different sort of demographics of utilities and customers. I think the Power Pool is a good model for this. I think having broad regional organizations that have a clear mandate from folks that voluntarily subscribe to those organizations and voluntarily agree to work as a group across different lines, I think is critical, because the solution is really dependent on everybody working together. I think because of the changing nature of the system, what was described by the panel and by Commissioner Johnson as well, I think you need to get every last bit of utility and value out of the assets that we have. And in order to do that, we need to work together in ways that I think we didn't before. So each entity has its own sort of authorities that they have or that they're subject to, in terms of whether it's a commission or elections or elected boards or whatever, or for in the case of Bonneville, our statutes and the administrator. And so given that there are so many different paradigms and models for the production and delivery of electricity to consumers, and every consumer is equally important, right? It's nobody's fault if they're served by an IOU or a public or anything else, right? Everybody has the same, a shared right to have reliable electricity service. So I think having broad organizations that everybody is willing to join and provide a clear mandate to is going to be critically important. I think the Power Pool is a good example of that. And building on that in the West, I think is going to be the way to manage these risks moving forward.
this is an interesting question for us. We don't have a compliance mandate like Chris. We don't represent states where there's sort of clear authority over the planning and reliability processes for utilities. BPA has its statutes. So, I sort of feel like, although, not directly, we've managed to, establish a body, a framework, a governance structure, a program that has allowed those broad interests to sort of stay in the tent. We're often criticized about certain technical decisions we've made. Why didn't you do sort of X, Y, or Z? And the answer is, we've tried to be thoughtful, maintain, establish a program which we believe will go a long ways in maintaining reliability for the broader Western, region and footprint in a way that keeps the maximum amount of load sort of under the compliant reliability umbrella. And so to Russ's point, I think that is part of the challenge. It takes, public utilities, investor-owned utilities, those folks providing consumer choice or third-party service to sort of really, identify a need and then work together, stay in the tent, sort of move the ball forward. So.
Yeah, being a former public service commission employee who worked at IRPs, I see a partnership between the utility and the PSC and the legislature trying to get it right, where the ultimate responsibility comes down to the utility and they have to serve their load. So, but the PSC is responsible for making sure they do that. And there's fines, there's issues that can happen there. But now I work on the public side of things. At the council, we deal with BPA, and we meet a lot of the utilities and the general managers and the board of directors for public power. And it comes down to the general managers, it comes down to the board of directors at the public utilities, then it comes ultimately down to BPA, who's responsible for things. And organization, the Power Planning Council, I feel we have a lot of responsibility too, because under the Power Act, that's our role in the Pacific Northwest, to do a power plant every 5 years and do resource adequacy assessments every year, just to see if things are looking okay and if things need to change.
All right, last call for panelists. What a great discussion.
Commissioner Johnson,
Yes.
want to note that we have had, very good participation from, stakeholders in Montana, of course, Northwestern Energy participating, in the program design, but we've talked to folks that represent, refineries in Montana. We've talked to folks that are, in the PURPA process, generating resources to Northwestern. So I do want to say sort of, on behalf of the folks that we've talked to in Montana, we've gotten very good participation, have appreciated, what they have brought to the table in terms of perspective. You have some uniquely situated in Montana. And so from the WPP's perspective and the RAP, we have very much appreciated participation from stakeholders in your state.
Well, that is great to hear, and I appreciate those remarks. With that, again, what a great panel. Let's thank the panelists for a really great discussion. And with that, we have reached the end of the agenda for day one. I can encourage all of you strongly enough to join us again tomorrow, and keep in mind you should be working on thoughts of how we can identify and articulate those core issues that we need to pursue as we go forward. Because when we get to the last session of the day tomorrow with our working groups to try and accomplish that goal with regard to next steps, your participation is going to be vital. With that, thank you all very much, and we will see you tomorrow morning.
Thanks, Fred.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Right, this was good. Sorry it took us so long to, get back into it, but we made it.
I'll tell you, really scrapped a lot of it.
Your staff did a great job putting it together for sure.